Good afternoon and welcome to all of you to this final Global Futures conversation for this year. Some of you remember that we had two of these sessions during the year. In January, we had one on confronting climate extremes, and then during Earth Day in April, we discussed the impact of 55 years of Earth Day. The conversations are meant to bring together experts from around the university, from around the Global Futures Laboratory, to discuss timely issues and options for solutions to some of the critical challenges that we are facing. They are meant to not only reflect the breadth of expertise across our network, from scholars, students to industry and outside experts, but also serve as a reminder that we actually possess more knowledge than we are applying. And some of what we try to highlight is, what do we know about some of the critical issues that is not being implemented, and what can we imagine to do about that? So today's conversation is around the field of conservation. And to many of you who follow what happens at the Global Futures Laboratory and ASU in general, this is not a surprise, because just recently we officially launched a new school, the School of Conservation Futures, and that was done as a response of the feeling that the field of conservation is not really keeping track with the demand for solutions to the increasing challenges we are facing in that field. So that is really the background, but the conversation will not be just focusing on the school. It will really focus on the field in general, what it means, what it does, where it's probably lacking behind where it should be, and what that would really mean then for the school. So towards the end of the conversation, we will talk about the school, in case some of you are wondering, why are we talking about conservation? We are not talking about that new school. We will get to that towards the end of the conversation. We have a great panel today. To my left, I guess most of you know everybody, but nevertheless, we will go through a short introduction. To the left of myself is Leah Gerber. She's a professor of conservation science in the School of Life Sciences and directs ASU's and GFL Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. She's one of the world's leading conservation scientists. She serves on globally significant bodies charting the future of conservation. For example, the International Whaling Commission, the UN World Conservation and Monitoring Center, and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. Her research, teaching, and leadership advance the integration of science into decision-making to achieve sustainable biodiversity outcomes. On the far left from my side, the right on your side, is Marco Serrato. Marco is the Vice President of ASU's Learning Enterprise, which serves learners across their entire lifespan. As part of this role, Marco collaborates with academic units and faculty across the university to identify and oversee opportunities to serve such learners. He has experience developing initiatives with private, governmental, and non-governmental organizations in the United States, Latin America, Europe, Asia, and the MENA region, pretty much globally. And this includes serving as emeritus board member and former chair of the International Consortium for University-Based Executive Education. That's quite a mouthful, but I guess everybody knows what it means. His contribution in the higher education landscape have been featured by international media, including the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, among others. Next to Marco, we have Sharon Hall. Sharon is a President's Professor in the School of Life Sciences. Her research focuses on ecosystems resilience and complex interactions between people and nature near protected areas. She recently served as the Associate Dean of the College of Global Futures, as many of you know and remember, where she led strategy and academic program development to empower learners, educators, and scientists to address critical issues related to the health and habitability of the planet, including conservation, of course. She also served as co-PI on the National Science Foundation Advanced Institutional Transformation Award, which is meant to improve processes in faculty advancement and success. And she recently served as special advisor for charter initiatives in the School of Life Sciences. So please join me in welcoming today's speakers. So before going into the questions, just a few words on the context for this session. If we are looking at the world as that we live in today, we see a planet that actually has natural boundaries, often called planetary boundaries, and we put them under immense pressures from overexploitation of these natural resource bases. Humankind, as one of about 10 million known species, has moved out of equilibrium with nature, which we are actually an integral part of it. Sometimes we see ourselves as outside nature, controlling nature, stewarding nature, but in essence, we are part of nature, and that is something that we have to recognize. This overexploitation increasingly and at an accelerated pace endangers the functioning of the life-supporting systems of our planet. So we frequently hear about these issues through climate change, but the climate crisis is not the root cause of the problems humankind has created for all life on our planet. Rather, it is actually an outcome. It is the result of too many people using too much energy from the wrong sources. And it has, this behavior has impact not just on the climate system, but also on all the other Earth systems, including those that are dealing directly or that conservation is dealing with directly. So while we have to pay close attention to the effects of climate change, these other elements of the Earth systems that are out of balance, including water, food system, biosphere, increasingly need our attention to the same degree that the climate system has. And this is where conservation comes into play. Conservation, of course, has a long history and plays an important role in understanding the health of our environment and in preserving the services that healthy ecosystems provide to us. But the field of conservation has become too static for a rapidly evolving world. This is why we are striving to envision a modern approach to conservation, one that is dynamic and can address the issues related to a rapidly changing world and all the interconnected effects that we are seeing from that, and then especially what can we do about that. So this will be the the discussion that we will have, the conversation that we'll have, will be dedicated to looking at the role of conservation in this overall context of a rapidly changing world. So let's start with Sharon. Sharon, we often hear about alarming rates of biodiversity decline. So what is the present situation actually, and what are the projections of this undesirable trajectory moving forward?
So biodiversity decline is, as you're saying, it's one of the many things that are happening all at once. And so some of the things that I think about is not just the species themselves, like, species have accelerated in terms of their diversification, and they've declined over time through Earth's history. That's just common. We know that species are created and some go extinct. The great acceleration of all of the energy use, but most importantly for biodiversity is our agricultural systems. It's just land use and land cover change is really altering not only the amount of places that animals and plants can live, but it's also changing the Earth's climate, which then puts these ecosystems into this feedback cycle that's going to accelerate the change for these habitats, for these species. So I think what's so alarming for me is not just the steady pace of species decline. Actually, when you take a look at how many species have declined and are extinct on the endangered species list, there are some places like Hawaii and islands where the extinction rate is really large. But what's happening is that all the organisms that share our community of life, their homes are being altered to a point where they can no longer live in them. And so what happens when that happens? For us, when our habitats are altered, we're gonna migrate for our good or for much, much worse. But for the animals and that plant species that naturally have migrated through Earth's history, what's in between where they want to be able to go? It's oftentimes a desert or a city or an agricultural field or a warming ocean. So I think in terms of the acceleration of species, it's not just the actual numbers of species that are in decline. We're reaching a point where the Amazon forest, the rainfall over the Amazon may slow to the point where the species, the plant species, the habitat in the Amazon is no longer going to be able to grow in the same way. The rainfall is going to change. And then what are all the downhill consequences from that? Well, all the people are going to be suffering, but what about all the blue morpho butterflies and all those really charismatic creatures in the Amazon that depend on the habitat that has this particular type of rainfall? So for me, I think this great acceleration is way beyond just species. It's the homes themselves that are being altered and that are sometimes unrecoverable. I mean, I was just thinking about this. I was talking to Manu. I caught him actually in a coffee shop, and I was like, Manu, how can we make it rain over the rainforest so that when we get past the tipping point where it's no longer raining, how can we geoengineer something so that it rains enough just to grow the rainforest back? I don't know. Manu's like, oh, please.
That's Manu's domain, right?
Yeah. So it's the habitats that I worry about that are in decline as well.
Leah, we hear voices that talk about the 6th mass extinction driven by human activities. How are you thinking about that? But also, what are known solutions to halt the possible consequences of what Sharon just described?
That's an interesting question. So, as Sharon described so eloquently, we are facing an unprecedented rate of extinction, which is the motivation for the field of conservation, which evolved back in the 80s, specifically to address the extinction crisis. Here we are now, and things haven't changed a whole lot, despite the evolution of a discipline. Similar to emergency medicine, it's a crisis discipline. So a lot of what we have found and the approaches that we have taken have been, wow, this is really bad, let's put a Band-Aid on it to prevent it from dropping below this critical threshold, say 50 individuals, rather than looking at the problem in a more holistic, systematic, strategic way to think about what populations, what species, what ecosystems are most important to intervene on, and which ones we can actually impact. Because in many cases, as Sharon was talking about, we've passed the point of reversal. So in the discipline of conservation, I like to argue that we have not actually done a good job documenting what works. There has been some work, specifically out of Cambridge. There's a project called the Conservation Evidence Project, and with that work, a colleague, Bill Sutherland, has done a great job starting to synthesize evidence for different taxonomic groups on what works. That's what works, but then there's the issue of cost. Something may work, but we don't have the money to do it. So really to get at the efficiency of, given a fixed budget, what can we do? We need to incorporate both what works and the cost to then get at an efficient approach to allocating the limited resources that we have. Because frankly, one of the thoroughfares in conservation is that globally, we lack the full set of resources that are needed to address the problem. In the US, we're only funding about 20% of what is needed to reverse the biodiversity loss. So we have to be strategic. So that's a long-winded sort of setting the stage. But in terms of what works, we know, as Sharon mentioned, on land, one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss is habitat loss, primarily due to agriculture. So habitat restoration, is something that works in that context. In marine systems, overexploitation, fishing particularly, is the largest driver of biodiversity loss. So mechanisms to prevent overfishing are appropriate for marine systems. But it's much more nuanced in terms of context. One thing we've learned is that despite the method that we come up with here in our university, I think co-designing the approach in situ with communities is the way to go, because we've learned from the last 30 years of the discipline that coming up with these approaches and going to try to solve it doesn't work. So I think in addition to looking back at history of what has worked and doing that in a systematic way is one way of learning about this. The other is we may not have even thought of it, especially when we start thinking about the integration of indigenous knowledge with the way we have been doing conservation. So I'm really excited about what we have to learn. That said, there's an urgency, so it's an opportunity to learn, but we also need to act quickly as we implement these interventions.
Sticking with universities for a moment, Sharon, what role does your academia have to play in addressing these problems, and why did we fall behind?
This is such a great question. I mean, here we all are sitting in the university, and if you let faculty members who are trained up as faculty members who write papers to publish them in academic journals, to learn more about the world and just think and learn, then it's going to be really hard to then train the next generation to get out there and learn and understand how to use economic knowledge and indigenous knowledge and psychology and sustainability, which ties all of these together in a way to empower communities to save this green-billed parrot or whatever species of conservation concern in their community. And so I think the problem has been this like decades and centuries of navel gazing in the university, where we have ideas about how the world should work, and so then we put those out into motion, and then we send our students out with an incomplete set of tools. But what's really interesting is that many of our students who have graduated from these programs are then now in the agencies, Fish and Wildlife or NGOs, who are actually frontline practitioners of that work. And so they are doing that work, but it takes them a long time to retrain, because they realize, wait a minute, if we had only asked the frontline communities or the NGOs who actually know what the problems are, ask them first, how should we build a curriculum, or how should we train our students, or what if we pause your undergraduate or graduate time and send you off into an internship to do the work, and you can bring that back to the university. Instead of doing that, we've continued on and thought, well, we have this idea and knowledge and evidence, but we're not connecting with the practitioners that need that. So the result of that is that we've got some, just as an example, some of our game and fish colleagues are protecting species here, the ferret, the Chiricahua leopard frog, and I asked, you ask, how much are you working with universities? They're like, we're not. Well, why not? Well, because faculty members are too busy publishing their papers. I mean, really, like, they're too busy doing these other things in order to get tenure, because they need to be publishing in these set of journals, and they aren't available to do the type of work that might be really hands-on, like if the Phoenix Zoo, which is captive breeding Chiricahua leopard frogs, which is our local home endangered species, by the way. If they're captive breeding these animals and they're releasing them, they don't have no idea what the survival rate. Is this working? Is it not? They have a grant to do it, so they're gonna do it, but they need some scientific help. They need a lot of bodies to go in there and do some husbandry, which is super cool, because many of our students actually would love to get their hands on some frogs. How cool, catching frogs. I mean, we all love that, right? And it gives students all sorts of skills too. So we just haven't stitched these things together. But what's amazing is that we have these experts all around us. They're here in Tempe, They're right across the river at the Phoenix Zoo in the Desert Botanical Garden. They're all through Arizona. They're throughout the United States. It's just the universities are so busy doing our thing because we're important, apparently, that we're not taking the time to actually ask what's needed. So I think this is an opportunity here at ASU with this idea of conservation futures to do everything differently, from training all the way to partnerships, all the way to fundraising, in order to stitch these things together to put dollars into the hands of people that can actually use it.
So we are too isolated from the real world, and
Yes.
we actually see the reaction from the real world by looking at us as increasingly less relevant to what is happening. That leads me to a question for Marco. So talking about workforce, if we want to train a more dynamic workforce that is better prepared to address conservation challenges in the real world, together with those who are working out there on conservation issues, what should we envision in terms of offerings from an academic setting?
Thank you, Peter. And I should start saying I really appreciate the question because I'm not an expert in conservation like Leah and Sharon are, but I can try to do my best to connect the pieces with the workforce development part. I think that answering the question, I will split that into two parts. One, I think that I was actually taking some notes on what Leah and Sharon were sharing, which I think speak out the what is happening and why that is important nowadays. And I think that the question is leading towards how can we address that? And when we speak about, I would say, workforce development or talent development, I will actually split it in two parts. And I think that what happens in conservation, and Leah mentioned this as well, this needs to happen as soon as possible. So how can we create an impact? And what we usually do within learning enterprise when we support our schools and colleges and something that is very important in conservation in particular, I would say, is how can we support individuals within the field? I think that's one part of it, individuals within the conservation sector. But second, I would say, in addition to that, it is also important to create an impact in society overall. And what I mean by that is, yes, we need to develop the workforce, but even how we as individuals within society are a key part of the learning outcomes that we would like to achieve is not just people learning something, not just acquiring knowledge or skills, but quite often we want them to act different. So it has a behavioral concept associated to that. So with that in mind, what I want to highlight is we develop, and this is part of the work that we have in place with the College of Global Futures, with the new School of Conservation Futures, with Peter, with Mickey, and with all of the faculty as well, is we need to develop programs that are targeted to the individuals within the field, within the sector. And it's not just about what are the fields, what are the topics. Sharon was just highlighting, I was capturing geoengineer something. Leah mentioned, we're not doing a good work at documenting something. We have some psychology components associated to that. So that implies everything that they were sharing is about how do we develop the right, I would say, technical skills, but there's also a set of human skills. And when we speak about those two, on the technical skill side, what is happening nowadays in terms of technology is that the life cycle of technical skills, life cycle meaning how relevant they are out there in the market, that life cycle is shrinking just because of how fast technology is changing out there. So we need to develop programs that actually allow individuals to upskill and reskill in a continuous manner. And on the other end, when we speak about the so-called human or soft skills, and this is crucial in conservation as well, I usually make a comparison with the health sector. You know, can you claim that you are good at team collaboration because you took a program with ASU 10 years ago? That helped you for sure, but human skills, soft skills, they're not fully developed. They're also nurtured throughout time. I usually make the comparison with health. I really like running, but I cannot claim that I'm in good health because I ran the New York Marathon 10 years ago. Same thing happens with human skills. They need to be nurtured. So just to wrap it up, the point that I want to highlight is it's about how do we develop the types of programs that address the technical skills and the human skills as well. and how they are delivered as well. And we have some of our faculty that are working on these offerings in terms of how they are delivered in an online, synchronous, asynchronous manner, in a hybrid format, including in person, because quite often that implies experiential learning as well. So how to design all of those pieces and bring them all together is crucial.
It's a great point in terms of how long the knowledge that you gain in an institution such as a university lasts you in your career. When I was trained, it was hammered into our mind. You learn something really well and you do it for the rest of your career.
Correct, exactly.
Today, you probably have more than 5, probably more, closer to 10 different jobs throughout your lifetime if you are graduating today. So is there one example from Learning Enterprise where you have managed to retrain a workforce at the kind of speed that is needed by the evolving world?
I will actually highlight 2 examples. The first example is a low-hanging fruit for me, I would say. Think of, I will relate that actually to your example, Peter, in terms of the value of a degree. I also have a professor appointment at Thunderbird, one of ASU schools, and I teach a data analysis course, which is my academic field, and I used to ask this question where I used to ask my students, do you remember the first time that you used the internet? And until 3 or 4 years ago, I could have several students raising the question. All of a sudden, I saw that my students were like, what are you talking about? Because they're already part of a generation that was born with the internet. That made me feel old, by the way, but the second question that I asked them is, do you remember the first time that you used generative AI? And I'm using just that as an example because what we are doing nowadays through Learning Enterprise, working with our subject matter experts, with our faculty from schools and colleges, is right now, no matter what industry, sector, function you are part of, upskilling, reskilling happens to us as professors as well on how we reinvent the learning experience using generative AI or AI. So that's a very specific example where actually no matter what your role is, you need to upskill or reskill to be AI literate. So just the way that you know how to read, how to write, now you need to be fluent at using AI. The second one that I will mention, just to make a similar comparison, is related to data analysis. And it's at some extent related to AI as well. I usually say every single conversation about AI starts about data because AI works based on data. And that's another topic that we're working with a lot of corporations, employers, private, public sector, NGOs on upskilling and reskilling on data and on data literacy as well.
So looking at successes, Leah, how does the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes engage in these issues? And do you have an example of where you were successful in, enabling a change in how we are dealing with some of the issues?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about CBO. For those of you who aren't familiar with CBO, Center for Biodiversity Outcomes is a partnership with Global Futures and the School of Life Sciences. We are in our 11th year, and the center was established to address the biodiversity crisis with the similar rationale to what we're talking about now, which is we in universities tend to be sort of motivated by curiosity, and we go down these rabbit holes of what we think is important or what might solve the problem, but then there's this whole other world of those who have the problems, and there was this big disconnect. And I had, throughout my career, spent a lot of time with working with NGOs and agencies who really had to address this problem like now, but then there was this whole body of scholars who things weren't connected. So that's part of the motivation for CBO, is to bridge that gap, and we do that through partnerships, education, and research. And we've learned a lot because I call CBO a boundary organization because we're bridging academic science and the rest of the world, specifically corporates, NGOs, and governments, to try to learn what are the relevant questions, but not just go away and do the work and come back with a nice answer that may not be actually, that's still the question. But instead, what we do is we co-produce. I know this is a term that is widely used, and some of my colleagues like to, in fact, from multiple disciplines, there are different definitions of what this means. But in essence, instead of doing it the way that we normally do, which is we go away and we come up with an answer that is no longer relevant, we work with the partner. And so we have lots of projects and partnerships, and one that I like to talk about to address your question, Peter, is with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So many years ago, it must have been about 10 years ago, there had been a piece in the New York Times that said, finally, the NGOs are pausing lawsuits against the agency to list species so that the agency could actually address the species declines instead of responding to lawsuits. I happened to have the chance to talk with one of the senior administrators at Fish and Wildlife and said, well, what's your approach? Like, how are you going to do this? You have like 6 months. And he's like, I don't really know. And I said, well, would you be open to collaborating? Because this is the type of work we do. And he said, yes. We threw together a proposal, and we wound up getting a team and a working group at Succinct National Social Ecological Synthesis Center. And we co-produced. So we had fish and wildlife scientists from all over the country, different regions, and scholars who work on conservation prioritization and recovery. And we developed an approach called the Recovery Explorer tool, which basically helps the agency state, here is my objective. My objective is cost. I want, for a fixed budget, I want to maximize the number of species I can save. Or it might be like, I want to focus on plants or endemic species. I'm not the person, it's not our role to specify what the objective is. But we created the tool, and we actually used ASU's Decision Theater in DC, and we had some workshops, and now they are being much more deliberate, because the upshot was that, as I mentioned earlier, we never have enough money to solve all the problems. So even if we have this small fraction, how can we best use it to maximize our outcomes? And in fact, with this, using the Recovery Explorer, we can actually save 200 more species than the status quo with the same budget. So it sounds all beautiful and lovely, but there is slow uptake in agencies, because we did it all, everyone was so excited, we published papers, but then they didn't have capacity to take it. But then they got a bunch of money and they started, but then now we're in the current political situation. So it's slow going. It's never been, you come up with something, you hand it over, and it changes. It could take 10 years, it could take 20. So it's incremental. And I feel like in conservation, we have to just keep doing the work and sort of have faith that there will be the opportunity for it to be relevant. So that's our role a lot as scholars in conservation.
So naturally, it is a slow and winding road, unfortunately. But in your view, do some of the successes that come out of this co-creation, overused word, but we all know what is meant, does that accelerate uptake, seeing that there is a positive outcome, or is it just still slugging away? And
I actually think that, well, first of all, we have to be clear what we mean by outcome, because I feel like it's not just the outcome.
The outcome.
Yeah, who defines the outcome? But then I think it's the process as well. And so I think developing those relationships with partners helps, or is an outcome in itself, because we have these relationships where we're interacting about a suite of problems that gives insight and innovation that we wouldn't think of on our own. So there's a potential for spurring innovation. And I think your point is well taken, that my definition of an outcome may be different than a community's definition. And this is something we talk about a lot in conservation. Early conservation really focused on, I just want to save species, get the people out of the way. Whereas now, I think we think a lot more, we realize that doesn't work. We realize that it's not going to work unless local communities are engaged and supportive. So we really need to listen to what people want and try to figure out ways that we can both protect biodiversity and support human livelihood.
So building upon that, Sharon, conservation is frequently seen as counting the population of wildlife and the number of plants. More advanced definitions, of course, say it is, preserving natural resources for future conservations, for future generations, which is more broad. More specifically, some expansions say we have to not just look at wildlife and vegetation, but also at what supports it, soil, water, nutrients, etc. But that still is narrow. How broadly do we have to define conservation in a modern world where so many things are interlinked?
I think a lot about some of the work that's being done just in northern Mexico right now, as an example, as an answer to this question. So there are lovely places that are protected for one reason or another in countries. And there's usually like a boundary, something on a map that was created in a time where those things mattered, that you could put a fence down and you could say, okay, this is a natural area protected, maybe limited use, and on the outside could do, it's gonna be for people, for agriculture, for whatever you want. I think now the idea of, first preserving pandas, then preserving an ecosystem approach. Now I think that we're beyond that, right? Because we need to think about landscapes and resilience of that landscape, because I'm thinking going back to these areas in Sonora where just in my mind, I'm thinking about the Wildlands Network, which is an organization that I work with that's in empowering a local community to preserve one of the northernmost parrot species in a coniferous forest in northern Mexico. What's happening in that forest is that it's protected. That ecosystem is technically protected. There's not a lot of development in there, but what crosses a boundary? Fire. So now fire is running through these ecosystems, through these coniferous forests, and so no longer does it matter that we protected in a legal or let's say land use way. Now what the Wildlands Network is doing is empowering the local community to be a fire brigade, because we care about this protected area, and not just for the charismatic parrot, but of everything that lives in this area. All the things that we know and all the things that we don't know, all the way down to the mycorrhizae in the soil that might help us someday to regrow crops in this region, all of these things. And so I think what we're aiming to do now is not just protect places on the planet, but it's to protect the dynamics of the system. We know that fire is natural in some areas. We know that it's accelerating its pace and its severity. We also know that the people who live there care very much about having protected areas near them, not only for the potential medicinal or mycorrhizae or whatever, but it could be for ecotourism. It's a really important area. It's their heritage. It's what's important to them. But now they're starting to think about protecting the fire regime rather than just protecting the ecosystem. But then that kind of breaks my brain, and maybe, it's something that we need to talk about, because how do you preserve a fire regime in an era that is no longer in existence, in a time when, let's say, the precipitation came at a regular pace where people could plant crops at a certain time? If suddenly we can no longer get rain-fed agriculture to grow in the amount that we need for our community, what are we gonna do as humans? We're gonna expand into areas that will grow those, because you're not gonna put drip irrigation down in some of these like wildland places, right? But then you think, okay, but we also wanna protect the parrot and its ecosystem. So I think now we need to think about resilience on the landscape scale, which is so much harder, because as soon as you break a boundary, now you've got to talk to those people who are over in the next village and make sure that they're on board. So it just, the complexity compounds socially and ecologically, and not only is it compounding in space, it's now compounding through time. And so I think that the type of thinking that we need to adopt in this new way is how do we constantly revise ourselves, constantly reinvent, make sure our educational system can keep up, and then prepare the generations and the elders in those communities who are going to be teaching those and building human capacity to just be able to think, okay, how do we then expand to these other areas and talk to other people? We need to kind of prepare everyone for a much more complex world than we have now. And that's really daunting, and we need everybody on board to do this. So I'm glad you're in this room and we can have this conversation.
Looking at the clock, and time is flying as always, there is so much we could talk about, but I want to get to the School of Conservation Futures, just to finish our discussion before we have some questions. So, Leah, what's your hope for this new school?
Well, my hope is that we can, by approaching conservation in a new way, by empowering learners in the way that approaching education in new ways that we've talked about, upskilling, field-based work, embedding students with communities, that we can actually both train a workforce and also learn about the things that actually work, both in education and in conservation interventions. You asked earlier about what works, so we can actually learn as we go, but such that we can be more equipped to achieve those outcomes that we desire. The other thing that we talked about earlier that I'm really excited about with the school is a new culture. Because, you know, Sharon talked earlier about, you know, we're in this bubble of the ivory tower, doing things that are out of curiosity because of the system we live in. We live in a system where we have to have X number of publications to get tenure, et cetera. And we tend to silo ourselves in our own little kingdom. We all have our labs. And I think that the only way we are going to get to addressing the biodiversity crisis in an effective way is by having a different culture that I call interdependence, where we're supporting each other towards a shared goal. And we're recognizing the diverse set of skills and backgrounds that we all have and working together as opposed to competing with one another. So I'm very hopeful that this new school will provide a way to do things differently, not only in conservation, but in academia.
A great point. And, you know, we have heard that we need more practitioners, we need more knowledge systems that come together, need a different makeup of faculty. So Sharon, how many norms do we have to break to make that a success?
Well, I think one thing that we could do differently is approach all the expertise that we have at ASU and approach it with openness in this school. That there are, Leah was talking about all the different expertise. It's not just within our department, it's all across our university. And of course, we're just one university among three or several in Arizona. But I think that what's most exciting to me is that I talk to my colleagues who are on Poly campus, who are on West campus, all over, and there are people who care about this issue everywhere. And if we can teach and model how to get outside of the publish or perish paradigm that we have for our faculty members, and show how to partner and raise money for these really high value projects with partners. I think that the Global Futures Lab and the college has done a really good job partnering and putting a lot of staff and money in that partnership part. I think a lot of units across ASU they see what's going on, but they're just not sure what's happening here and actually how to do that and how to get involved. So I'd like to see that in the new college as having this be a model of, here's this model that works. We're still kind of inventing as we go, but join and see and bring us your ideas and what partnerships do you have and can we empower you to do this work in your own unit. I think building capacity in units, in faculty, in communities where they are, I think for me is the most exciting.
What you said, I think, is true. We are just in the process. I think we have the design, we have the concept, we had laid the foundation. Now the question is, how fast can we accelerate? Right? We are up to the point where we have to scale at pace for maximum impact. And that is the experiment that's going on here, that in the end has to redefine what a university means for society. Marco, so to what extent does this new school depend on novel learning methods? Do we need something that is not yet in place, or do we simply have to apply what we know in an optimized fashion?
Let me highlight something, and I'm reflecting on the answer to that and connecting that with what both Leah and Sharon were sharing. Something that I would say that is unique about the School of Conservation Futures and the College of Global Futures overall, and I'm highlighting that from the perspective that the work of the Learning Enterprise Team on a day-to-day basis, we work with all ASU schools and colleges. If you would ask me, what is one thing that by design is already different with College of Global Futures and the School of Conservation Futures, and you have highlighted this in the past, Peter, is you are designing schools and academic programs with outcomes in mind. Like you always speak about outcomes and impact. And this might sound obvious, but this is not the case within a lot of academic units. And I just want to underscore that because that is a major difference. We have several programs that we are developing right now on indigenous collaborations, how to use drones, geographical information systems, the Internet of Things to influence conservation, public policy making in conservation. But all of the work that we are doing with all of you is you always start with the outcomes in mind. And I would just say, don't take it for granted because that is something that is unique, at least based on our experience with other schools and colleges about the work that you are doing. And nothing that at the end that speaks about what you all are doing. Connecting that to the learning piece, I will highlight this. I think that I previously mentioned some of the academic fields, but to Sharon's point as well, how you learn matters. And what success looks like from a program design perspective is not just, again, about what people learn, not just how they learn it, but what they do with that knowledge afterwards. And when you are focused on impact, I go back to the behaviors part, I go back to what those individuals in the sector will do. I think that's a key part that is a must to truly address that as soon as possible, as Leah was highlighting as well.
So we are at the end of our panel discussion, but I would like to take about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. I think there are microphones here. So I see somebody here and then over here. Oh, there are quite a few.
Nice.
So let's start here with.
That means we've been controversial.
Yeah, because you have your hands up always before I even ask the question.
Anyone could even try, I get the microphone. My question's actually for you, Peter. You sit at one of the highest levels at this university as a vice president, vice provost. You are a big part of shaping this experiment of the Global Futures Lab and the new culture of the school. And so what are some of the blockers at ASU to us accelerating? And in your opinion, as someone who understands the bureaucracy better than anyone in this room, what can we do as a community, as a lab, to encounter those with grace and get beyond them?
I'm not sure you want to know all the blocks.
I don't.
That are in
3 minutes or less.
Right.
How can we come together from where you sit?
There's a reception afterwards.
Yeah.
Talking
That's my big question for the room.
But I can tell you that I spend about 1/3 of my time to identify and try to move blocks. Obviously, we are still too traditional. I mean, it is a new university, quite a bit has been done, but there is a slowness in the system. Administrative structures are typically, too inert to follow the pace that we would like to see. the norms that we have in terms of defining how we look at metrics, but then it comes also back to us to define metrics, because it is much more difficult to define metrics in the outcome section than it is in counting papers. So there are two elements to answer your question. One is an appeal to all of us to put everything we have into defining metrics that are understandable to others in terms of why does it matter. And the other part is to just keep pushing that people understand that we are working on a topic that is different from, let's say, history or English or physics, where the topic we are dealing with is changing on a daily basis sometimes at a rapid pace. So we have to adjust the pace, and helping to push the system into a mode where it is able to accommodate pace.
Can I add to that? Okay. So I've been here 25 years. I was hired a year before Michael Crow came. And I remember being at a dinner party with some faculty colleagues early on. I was hired as a conservation biologist. And one senior colleague said, "Conservation, that's not a scientific discipline." And here we are. We have a school of conservation now. So things change, things evolve. And I wanted to mention that there's hope. Like, we've been talking very doom and gloom, but there are a lot of success stories where systems, species, there is resilience. There is a possibility to change the trajectory.
And absolutely true. And if you look at the Global Futures Lab, within 6 to 7 years, we build a fairly large structure. But to your point, 25 years, that's a long time. So we have to get from this 25 to 2.5, orders of magnitude.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. We had somebody over here.
So I would like to put forth an idea and get your response to it. In response to what we're talking about, conservation being a very dynamic, fast-changing space, both in terms of the ecosystems and the challenges, and talking about education and conservation needing to catch up in near real time with how we're equipping our students. Could part of that be, in terms of norms we break, breaking the norm that people think that a degree does give you everything that you need? Might we embrace and say, we're going to stop lying to you. And in fact, we're going to tell you, you need to the rest of your career continue to retool. And what we're going to give you the best chassis to be able to rebuild on. A chassis that's super versatile, but a solid foundation. And we're going to give you the skills to be able to acquire new things and build the type of conservation vehicle you'll need in whatever career. And furthermore, because we gave you the chassis and the skills, you come back to us when it's time to retool. And in fact, why don't you do that every year at homecoming for a week? All the College of Global Futures alums come, and that's what homecoming is about. And we do it so well that everyone wants to hire ASU Conservation Future grads because they know the power of our continuing education machine and that we are the most up-to-date because we started from the very beginning with the premise of this is what you will have to do. Can we do that? What do you think?
I love the idea. I'll defer to you guys. That's brilliant.
It's clear that you come from a school that thinks about the future. I was just going to say, just the other day, I was driving on the I-5 in California and passing all of the agricultural fields. You guys are driving up the 5 just like forever, right? And you're like, what are all these crazy signs about politics here? And then like all the dead almond trees. And suddenly I wanted to learn something. And so this chassis that you're talking about, Kiki, is this chassis of curiosity. And so what I did, because I was privileged enough to have Wi-Fi in my car, I just turned on ChatGPT and I was like, I am at this place, tell me. And I just got a history lesson and a politics lesson of every crop that I could see going up the I-5. And so this is what I think, I'm interpreting this as what you're talking about, because people are learning so differently now. I mean, and I'm old, right? But I'm just like constantly thinking, and I'm curious. I think someone tells me an idea, and I think I want to know more about that idea. And so I sit down and I read some papers on it, and I take a little tangent there. I think that's where this new way of learning can really operate. But I 100% agree with you. is that we need to be really cognizant that students are not going to sit down and read that textbook like we did when we were going to college. I think that we have to be doing something really differently.
Just building up on that very briefly, because I know that we have other questions. I cannot not complement, because to me, the reason why ASU's learning enterprise exists is precisely connected to what you are just describing. You know, my 30-second summary would be, what we are doing within ASU is we are redefining what it means to be a university. And by that I mean, yes, we are a degree granting institution. We've been doing that since day one. We are a research-oriented institution. Research is at the core of what we do. But we are also asking this question, you know, given that the context is changing so much and so fast out there, some of us are part of this generation, as Peter mentioned. When I finished my undergraduate degree, the value proposition was come and study with us for 4 to 5 years. And whatever you will learn on those 4 to 5 years will be helpful for the next 30+ years of your professional life. What you're just describing is that value proposition. Don't get me wrong, an undergraduate degree is and will continue to be very valuable because of the immersion learning experience. The point that you are making is not, but that might not be sufficient because of what is happening out there. And that is precisely what we are doing university-wide, and that's the enablement and the support that we are providing to our schools and colleges.
Manu, last question.
Okay, thank you for the privilege of doing that. So first, of course, congratulations for building what's likely to be one of the most exciting things that happens in this area. So I'm excited about that and how we can work together. But beyond that, you know, the sentiments that I heard from the three of you in particular spoke to action on the ground towards biodiversity and conservation. I like that. What I didn't hear is what I would like to ask about. And that's the drivers of biodiversity loss, and what do we plan to do about those? So the way I kind of look at it is, we live in a Eurocentric world for the last several centuries. So in the 19th century, if you look at the European literature, it talks about colonization in a very positive perspective. We learned that was not so good. So, but there were threads in that literature about conservation and biological diversity as well. You know, you come to the 20th century and we have a much more rapid growth of humanity in all aspects, culminating in globalization of all supply chains and a population that was unprecedented even in 1960s to where we have reached. So we have an increase in the number of people who need to eat the planet, and we have a much faster rate of consumption of the planet, which is what you're fighting against. And I would argue that the scale at which you do on the ground community activities is overwhelmed by what is happening on the other side. In the 21st century, this is going to be the century of Asia, with 4.5 billion people versus probably 750 million to a billion at most in the Eurocentric world. What is our plan to engage those people whose rate of consumption is now going to start approaching ours, and they are an order of magnitude larger? How do you compete with that? Do we have a thought as to how we are taking on the world and where it is going?
Who wants to take that?
I'll take a stab, but I would welcome input. I mean, so I really like the question about the drivers and how are we going to ameliorate these. And historically, we've thought about how do we address the individual threats: overexploitation, pollution, habitat loss, climate change, introduced species. How are we addressing those particular threats? But we've realized, and this is part of the work that I've done with IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Global Assessment. What we did was look at all of that, the global state of biodiversity and threats, and we realized that addressing things in a sort of one-off way towards those individual threats would not suffice because of the overarching driver of consumption in socioeconomic global patterns. And so the upshot is that we need a transformation in our social and economic systems. So by just existing the way we exist and saying, oh, we need less less exploitation, less habitat loss, et cetera, we're not going to get there. And so I always say, well, great, okay, so we need a transformational change, but how do we get there? Like, what are the steps? That seems so abstract. I don't know that I have the answer. I have some ideas. My idea is that we just keep trying and we learn as we go. And little by little, the systems change. For example, I think you were at Jack Kittinger's talk, talking about putting nature on the balance sheets. I think that's an important thing. I think reframing the way we interact with nature, incorporating indigenous knowledge, those are some of the ideas. So I definitely don't have the answer, but I think we have an opportunity to learn as we go.
That gives us a lot of opportunities to continue the discussion after this session. So we will have a little reception outside in the atrium. I hope all of you brought your down jackets.
I did.
Temperature seems to drop very quickly when the sun goes down these days, but maybe the conversations will warm you up, hopefully not overheating you. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists and conclude the session for today.